right, everyone. Welcome to lecture 8 in the series. This lecture is about a legal idea that every entrepreneur I meet seems obsessed with, but very few seem to understand. That is jurisdiction choice. So, where something sits legally matters at least as much as what you're trying to build. And entrepreneurs generally seem to understand that. So, some common approaches that I see in practice, which are all equally problematic from a practical standpoint, is that people will obsess over where to register a given entity or where to live as a natural person, or they'll be looking for that perfect jurisdiction where all the rich people register their business, or they'll just start in whatever country they happen to be born in, and they don't really think about if it's the best place for their idea. So, the point of this course is to teach basic business law concepts to people who are already in business. So we're assuming you've already started, really. And now we're focused on helping you keep your money. We're focused on that part of your journey, right? So if you're watching and you haven't started yet, then that's actually really good because you've found this law knowledge early, and hopefully you can start on the right foot based on what we're teaching you, because it's way easier and less expensive than fixing what's already been done. So with that in mind, you've already started. You're making money. Now you're focused on keeping it. Great. So this is the point where we see people start to obsess over structure or companies or LLCs, trusts, foundations. And yeah, sure, sometimes they'll obsess over jurisdiction. But if they do, they tend to get the battle plan backwards. That's the main mistake. So in this lecture, we're going to give you a mental framework and a checklist, as always. And it's to go through yourself and with your lawyers and your legal professionals to make sure that you get things the right way round. So a quick anecdote to start before we get into the lecture material. Let's call it the offshore tax hack story, right? It's actually the story that inspired today's lecture and the examples and the mental models. Anyway, a good friend of mine, he's a young lawyer. He's a young lawyer in Liechtenstein, and he told me this story. His firm was approached by a founder, a successful founder, very successful in his own operating, his core operating company, and he decided to set up some tax-free or tax-reduced company somewhere offshore, right? Someone online, he saw a short or a video or some piece of influencer content, and he was sold on this concept of low tax or zero tax. So he registered this company. You know the content I'm talking about, right? So from this company, he starts investing in US stocks and US ETFs from that company. And in this case, there's no tax treaty, there was no planning, there was no real thought about the details. And so suddenly he's getting hit with withholding tax in a big way, and he can't claim the credits properly, all these issues. And what he realized pretty quickly, though not quick enough, is that the company and jurisdiction were not designed for cross-border investing in the US in this case. So he's paying way more in tax than he should be. And what do we know from our previous lectures? What was his core mistake here, his foundational legal mistake, right? He didn't understand his own unique facts and circumstances, right? I'm going to go over this, going to drill this home in every lecture to get it in. This is the law, right? Facts and circumstances. So in the case of this specific particular entrepreneur, he didn't really spend time modeling the end state, the desired end state, and thinking about his own unique facts and circumstances, the kind of stuff that we've taught over and over again in the previous lectures. Okay, so Anyway, he's furious. He's jumping up and down. You know, this jurisdiction is low tax. I was told this jurisdiction is low tax, right? What he didn't understand was his own facts and circumstances, and he didn't understand the foundational legal principle, right? Low tax at home in the place of registration doesn't mean low tax everywhere else, right? Other countries will still take their bite at the source. And if you can't use treaty relief and you don't respect your own unique facts and circumstances, right, you can end up paying more, way more, not less. Okay, so in his mind, he optimized for the first order idea, right? Low tax or zero tax. And then he accidentally built himself a massive headache, okay? So, a practical point. All right, for a lot of businesses, not all, but a lot, what you're selling, how you're selling it, and to whom you're selling it, and where those people are that you're selling to, those factors will force you into a limited number of options for jurisdiction, certainly for your operating businesses, right? But we do live in an increasingly digital world, so that's becoming less and less true over time. And your options are growing in terms of jurisdiction, and that's great. But with that increase in jurisdiction options is an increase in risk. So we need to understand the foundational idea of jurisdiction more in the law, okay? So with that, we're going to start really, really simple. Simple question. What is a jurisdiction? Okay, so at the most basic level, a jurisdiction is a monopoly on violence and coercion in a specific geographic area, right? A jurisdiction is the dominant mafia for a territory, you can think of it as. We usually call it a government, and we'll use words like democracy or constitution or rule of law, right? And this helps us feel better about ourselves and that fundamental fact. But jurisdiction is the system that decides how force can be used against you and how your money can be taken from you, usually in the form of taxes. No, you don't get to opt out of this unless you're planning to create a more dominant mafia, right? If that's your plan, you're at the wrong channel. You should be watching How to Be a Revolutionary 101, or maybe you can start that channel, right? But for jurisdictions, key point, it's the interaction between jurisdictions that is just as important as any specific jurisdiction itself, right? Again, it's the interaction between the jurisdictions that is just as important as the specific jurisdiction itself. So, just setting up a company in some free zone in the UAE or in Labuan in Malaysia or one of the Caribbean islands isn't going to necessarily be a good idea. It definitely could be. It might be, right? It's totally possible. But it could also be way worse than a bunch of other choices that most people consider high tax places. So yes, these places, the UAE or Labuan or the Caribbean islands or wherever, there's a lot of them, they're tax-free on the label in the influencer videos, but usually only if you're constrained in that one jurisdiction. Once you're across jurisdictions, it gets way more complicated. Jurisdictions don't just matter individually, they interact with each other. And most people, most entrepreneurs, most business people miss that completely or fail to appreciate it fully. So you'll see people think in single jurisdiction terms. That's the main problem. And they'll ask dumb legal questions like, where is low tax? You need to stop doing that. Hopefully at this point in the lecture series, you don't ask dumb legal questions anymore. You know how to ask correct legal questions, not where is low tax. It's only half the picture. The law thinks in multi-jurisdictional chains. Where is the money coming from and where is the money going to? The mistake is assuming if my company is in a low tax place, my activities and my investments will be low tax. That is the point of the earlier story with our entrepreneur, right? That was the mistake he made. That's almost never true, right? All right, so we're going to get into the framework. All the notes on Substack, as usual, guys. Yes, it's free. So, five things to think about when you're thinking about jurisdiction in whatever transaction you're about to do with your legal professionals and your tax advisors. Let's call it four, actually, four key things, all right? You need to think, where is value coming from and where is it going to? Right, that's the first key thing, two sides of the equation. Where is the value coming from and where is it going to? Is there a tax treaty between those two sides? How does the source country, the place where the money is coming from, how does the source country deal with the recipient country, the place where the money's going, and does relief exist, right? So you need to ask yourself those questions to start. All right, so the best way to do this, as usual, is through a basic example, okay? Otherwise, it's probably just going to get confusing and dry, okay, because it is tax stuff for a lot of it. So your lawyer and your tax advisors, or your lawyers and your legal professionals, are responsible for executing this stuff anyway, okay? So we're just here to help you interact with these professionals properly, understand the basics of business and the law, and then you'll be able to engage with them and instruct them properly. All right, so let's set up the example to start. So we'll have to start a quadrant. We're going to have, this is a very basic example. This example is just to illustrate a point today, right? A very basic point to show again. So you're going to have a free zone company that you've set up for investing. You're going to have your operating company, the company that is making all your money, right? Your company selling dildos on Amazon, whatever. You're going to have your investments over here, right? You're investing in US equities, like our friend from our earlier story. And then you're a natural person just here, right? That's it. So they are the parties that are involved in this. Here you've got the source of the money, where all your investments are. You've got your operating company, the company that's responsible for, the company that does business, where you make money, right? This new free zone company that you've set up in order to do investments, and you here as a natural person, right? Okay, very simple setup. So in this example, you've got, all this is set up, right, already. If you want to dive into more detail about transactions and how these sorts of things are set up to begin with, then go back to the previous lecture on transactions. But all this is done already, right? The investments are made, the US equities are bought, the capital gains are accumulating, and the dividends are earned, right? Okay, so the income is arising outside of the, this is a UAE, right? Is rising outside of the UAE. It's in the US, okay? So the idea of the UAE as a low tax jurisdiction is true for only one side of this equation. The equation's incomplete. The other side matters, right? In this example, the source of the value, it's US publicly traded businesses. So the source of the capital gains or the source of the dividends, the other side of the equation, right, is important. Here it's, you know, it's higher tax. It's generally high tax, right? And it does not like the receiving side of the equation. That's not a political or geopolitical statement, right? These two countries are allies. What I mean by does not like, right, is that there's no tax treaty here. There's no good tax relationship between these two sides of the equation, okay? So in that way, it's a good example, a basic but good example for two reasons. Firstly, everyone is obsessed at the moment with UAE free zone companies online. But the UAE has limited tax treaties with many source countries. To be fair, I love the UAE. Don't get me wrong. It's a great place and it's doing an amazing job of increasing its tax treaty network. But there are some places where you may very well want to invest where it doesn't have a tax treaty. Because there is no tax treaty, right? The source country It might apply full withholding tax on dividends, full withholding tax on interest, if there's any interest that's accumulated as investment income. It might have exit taxes, who knows? There might be reduced rates, no relief, etc., etc. The key point is that the tax happens before the money ever reaches the UAE company. So the UAE as a low tax place is irrelevant, right? You need to start thinking of jurisdictions as an equation, right? That needs to be in balance. Here, they're not in balance, okay? They need to be in balance on both sides, okay? That's the point. It's the interaction between the sides that matters, not one specific side. Here, the equations are out of balance. Okay, so again, to be clear, I don't want to be misunderstood. The UAE is amazing. I love the UAE. It's great. You should definitely go and visit. It's one of the best places in the world to live and do capitalism. But it's only one side of a two-sided coin. Now, if this entrepreneur invested in local UAE stocks and he himself, as a natural person, lived in the UAE, then it might be a different story. It would certainly be a different story. But in this case, he's using this UAE entity to buy stuff in jurisdictions that are hostile to the UAE. So it's a worst case scenario. I don't mean hostile in that I'm making a geopolitical or political statement. These two are allies. They just don't have good tax arrangements between them. So the net result in our example is that this company here made these investments, but it's going to end up earning less money than expected, often significantly less, when it could have been earning a lot more, right, with a little bit of thought, instead of buying the low tax or tax-free on the label. Okay, so I imagine at this point, your eyes are probably glazing over, right? Withholding tax, tax credits, blah, 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 etc., etc. It's tedious. You've got a business to run, I understand. I also find this stuff tedious. It's not a problem though. You don't need to know all of the details in depth. To be frank, very few do. But you will need a good tax advisor, and you'll need at least a basic understanding of the legal concepts, right? You also need a good tax advisor in each jurisdiction here. There's potentially 4 different jurisdictions here in this example. So you would need a good tax advisor in each, right? Because these professionals generally only know the jurisdiction that they're in. That's important to understand. The reason should be obvious. This stuff is super complicated, and to be across it for more than one jurisdiction is simply not feasible. You can go wide with knowledge or you can go deep. You want professionals that are going deep, which means they're usually going to be knowledgeable about their jurisdiction only. Okay, so the basic takeaway for you as a business person, as an entrepreneur, is this. Jurisdiction is an equation. It is not a one-sided coin. You also need to consider how you're going to take benefit yourself, right? On top of all of this, down here, out of this setup, okay? The money has been taxed to high hell, right? But it's going to arrive in that free zone company. Much less of it than you would have liked, but it's going to get there. And then the question is, how are you going to get it? How are you going to benefit from it, right? And then, right, the relationship of your personal residence country to the UAE also matters now, okay? Or maybe it needs to move back to the holding company before it gets to you, okay? Then the not the holding company, the operating company. Maybe it needs to move there for some legal reason, okay? Then the jurisdiction of the operating company is going to matter also. You've got an equation here. Maybe they're out of balance too. Who knows, right? So here you're looking at that part of the equation. The point is, where profit is earned matters for sure. But where profit is enjoyed, right, it matters just as much, okay? Jurisdiction risk really isn't about one side of the equation. It's about the full path of the money. Every time value originates, crosses a border, right, or is paid out, a new legal system potentially gets a chance to tax it or regulate it or reclassify it. So the question isn't, the poor legal question isn't, where am I registered or where should I register? It's which jurisdictions touch this cash flow, at what point, and with what rules. Okay, so now let's compare this with, let's call it here, let's make this country, let's make the investment country registration Dutch, right? Okay, so I'm going to compare it with the so-called high tax jurisdiction. To be sure, a lot of places in the EU, for example, there are many around the world, have earned their reputation as high tax in a lot of ways. The Netherlands is in the EU, one of them, right? Maybe you think of it as high tax, maybe the people who you talk to think of it as high tax. The reputation may be well earned and maybe not, okay? They're also incredibly tedious places in the EU to do transactions from. They're slow, they're overregulated. Everyone understands that. In practice, they're horrifying. But in this basic example, right, in this alternative setup where instead of investing via a free zone company in the UAE, we've used a Dutch company, right? And we've still invested in US stocks, right? We've got an extensive treaty network. We've got potentially reduced withholding taxes. Maybe we've got participation exemptions, capital gains exemptions, all depending on the unique facts and circumstances of the investments. But all those things are in play. Credit mechanisms, right? So, point is, you've got the same investments on this side of the equation, but you can end up with a very different result, even with an entity. Just a simple change in this side of the equation to an entity that's in a place that everyone thinks is high tax, right? So that's the point. And then even after you pay some local taxes on either side, you could very well end up keeping a lot more money. So the bad legal question, which you guys no longer ask anymore, where is tax low, right? If you're going to be asking where questions, then you're asking jurisdiction questions. And then you need to think of it as two sides, right? As a coin with two sides. Where is the value coming from, right? And where is the legal entity or natural person that is receiving it? And when those two things work well together, right, then you're cooking. Then it's great. Then you're understanding. All right. It's also important to remember at this point in the discussion that tax and jurisdiction law issues, right, this is a business law channel. We're about keeping your money. But there are other important issues when it comes to jurisdiction before tax, for sure. Okay, there is a lot more to consider. Tax is important because it will probably result good understanding of this foundational principle is essential, but it'll also result in the biggest gain, right, with the least amount of work. You just need to understand the principles, okay, and work with the best professionals, obviously. But there are other factors when it comes to jurisdiction. So you've got to think about things like enforcement culture in the country or jurisdiction. That matters. You can have the same contract, the same written law, and come up with a completely different reality depending on the jurisdiction. Some jurisdictions will have courts that move fast. You'll get realistic injunctions, or collection, if you win a court case, will actually happen. But then you'll have other jurisdictions where cases will drag on for years or decades. And then if you win, it doesn't even mean you can collect the money. And then delay is actually an established legal strategy for your opposition, right? So your risk isn't just what the rules are, it's whether you can enforce it through the courts when it absolutely counts, right? Another one that's really important in the year 2026 and becoming increasingly important is reporting obligations, right? These can definitely become more dangerous for your money than tax, practically. Tax is often predictable and very boring, but reporting can absolutely be a trap, right? So you can get hurt by FATCA reporting or beneficial ownership filings and economic substance forms, the rules around this sort of stuff, late filing penalties, it goes on and on, right? So you can save tax, but you can still get fined and get accounts frozen, lose your banking, trigger investigations. There's no faster way for your business and your money to die than under a huge weight of paperwork that you had no idea existed. Another one that trips up, especially digital nomads that I see all the time, and digital wandering business people, is place of effective management. And this can override incorporation. You may spend all of your time thinking about where to incorporate, right? But where you're incorporated is one thing. Where you actually run your business is another, and it matters. So if you make decisions from some country, and then you direct the business day to day from this country, and you approve deals and approve money movements from this same country, then that country may say, yes, this company is effectively managed here, so it's resident here. We don't care where it's registered, all right? And then they'll just suck that entity or that company into their tax net, right? And then you'll be exposed to all their tax residency rules and their reporting and their regulatory exposure. So basically, your laptop can move your company without you even realizing it. Okay, that one gets the digital nomads quite a bit. How you can enforce contracts practically. That's also very important, right? So look, a contract is just a bit of paper, right? It needs to be enforced. So it's only as strong as the courts in a jurisdiction and the speed of those courts and the remedies and the actual ability to collect the money after a court case. So that's also another really important consideration when it comes to jurisdiction. In some places, contracts are a shield, but in others, contracts are they're just paperwork, often meaningless in some jurisdictions. There's also a concept of regulatory surface area. So the jurisdiction will determine how many regulators can touch you. Some jurisdictions have a lot of regulators for everything, and some jurisdictions have a very light regulatory touch, let's say. All right, and there's all kinds of triggers for these. You've got consumer protection, advertising rules, education and coaching rules, fintech rules, data privacy is a big one, right? The more surface area you have, the more ways you can be forced to stop or pay damages or change your setup. Okay, and then you've got employment issues, is another big one, right? Hiring is not just a business decision, it's also a legal relationship, right? It can vary greatly between jurisdictions. Some places will make it very easy on a relative basis. You'll have flexible contracting options and it'll be easier to hire and fire people. And then others are going to be France, basically. So you can't call people after 3 in the afternoon, or you have to give them a 4-hour lunch, or you have to pay back pay and penalties if you annoy them a bit, right? And then, of course, the big one in 2026 as well as reporting is banking regulations, okay? So this isn't tax. This is like the practicalities of dealing with your money once you've earned it. So can you open a bank account? How many compliance requests are you going to get? Are you going to get funds frozen all the time, right? Payment process is going to accept you. Yeah, I mean, the list really at this point in the year 2026 is endless. We don't want to overwhelm you. The point being, right, is that it's not just about tax. Jurisdiction is about a whole host of issues, right? So I guess the key takeaway from this lecture, right? Jurisdiction is a two-sided coin, okay? Where is the value coming from and where is it going to? Only looking at one side is incomplete. The other key point that you should take away from especially that last rant about all of the stuff that applies to jurisdiction apart from tax is that you don't want to skimp on legal professionals, please. Legal professionals, good quality legal professionals and tax advisors are an investment. Terrible legal professionals will cost you money. Good legal professionals will make you money. Hiring the best legal professionals and tax advisors is hard. When you understand the basics of business law, you can hire the best, and then you can keep more of your money. That's why we teach this course, so you can look competent at doing transactions, and then you can hire the best people, right? A zero tax jurisdiction without treaties is often the most expensive place, at least to invest from, right? Courts do not have universal reach. That's another one to remember. Very important practically. Their powers stop at borders, for better or for worse, right? That might be good for you or bad for you, depending on what side of a dispute you're on. Jurisdiction defines how far the court's power can go. Another practical point, a judgment from a court is not the same as enforcement. Some places will enforce aggressively and you'll be able to collect, or the opposition will be able to collect from you. And then other jurisdictions barely enforce at all. All right, so remember, because this is a practical guide for entrepreneurs, jurisdictions and jurisdiction choices are very often hard to undo. Sometimes they're legally hard to undo, sometimes they're economically hard to undo, sometimes both, right? Many jurisdictions are easy to enter, but they are not easy to leave.